cut taxes and we cut regulations, that we could, in fact, have dramatically higher growth. Just cutting out stupidity saves you about a third of the total deficit. If we reduced the Pentagon to a triangle, you would have a better defense system. Those two groups disagree so bitterly that we're engaged in a politics of annihilation. When you have opponents who are that deeply opposed, one side wins and one side loses.
Our founding fathers here in this country brought about the idea that you and I have within ourselves the God-given right and the ability to determine our own destiny. The only way they can inherit the freedom we have known is if we fight for it, protect it, defend it, and then hand it to them with the well-thought lessons of how they in their lifetime must do the same. Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction.
Today, we're over $34 trillion in debt. Our debt keeps rising every single day. Representative Tom Massey wears a debt clock on his lapel every day in Congress, just showing how much it's going up every single day. And quite frankly, I think the debt issue, the rise of national debt, one of the biggest issues that's going to face my generation, Gen Z's future, that we're going to have to figure out or suck up one way or another. So here to talk about that and quite a bit more of the latest breaking news across the country is former Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. But while he was Speaker, we had a balanced budget. And that's the last time in our country's history we had a balanced budget. So I'm glad to welcome you, Mr. Speaker. It's great to have you.
Well, I'm glad to be with you. And somebody pointed out recently that in the last 100 years, the only 4 consecutive balanced budgets came out of the House Republicans with the contract with America. So I do know it can be done because we did it. And I do think you could get back to a balanced budget, but it would take a very disciplined, thoughtful, planned approach that did the right things. You can't do it just by being cheap. You have to have a strategy.
And with the strategy, when you were Speaker, was the strategy focused more on giving incentives to the American people? Was it about spending efficiently? Was it about simply managing what you already had? What was the focus
the first
on?
Part of the strategy is pure economic growth. I came out of the supply side debate in the 70s. I worked with Jack Kemp and President Reagan, and I knew that if we cut taxes and we cut regulations, that we could, in fact, have dramatically higher growth than anybody expected. And that's really important because the higher growth then yields higher revenues. Second, we knew that there had to be big structural reforms. The biggest of them was reforming welfare and turning it into a work program rather than a dependency program, led to the largest increase in children moving out of poverty in American history. As their parents earned more money, they were better off. Had a huge windfall effect for the states because people left Medicaid to get into private insurance, and they left food stamps, and they left welfare in general. So that very important is structural reform. We created Medicare Advantage, which the Biden-Harris administration is trying to kill. And that Medicare Advantage was very, very popular and saved about $200 billion, which was probably technically our most amazing achievement, was passing major Medicare reform during a presidential year with AARP's backing. So all those things came together. Then finally, we did approach just cutting out things that didn't need to be bought. And if you looked at the current process, there's a group called Open the Books, which studies spending at a very detailed level. They estimate that the Biden administration will have had a minimum of $1 trillion in spending that was totally inappropriate or wrong. For example, in California, $20 billion was stolen from the California unemployment compensation system, largely by prisoners in California prisons using the California computer systems. I mean, it's one of those things you can't quite believe how stupid it is. So you would go through and eliminate bad spending, unnecessary spending, etc. You would dramatically cut regulations and taxes, so you really incentivize entrepreneurs and small businesses. And you would look at every possible way to have the kind of reforms that provide better outcomes at lower cost or provide such dramatically better outcomes at the same cost. And your goal is to create such a dynamic America that you literally pull away from the rest of the planet in economic capability, which then means you're also pulling away from the rest of the planet for national security reasons.
And to touch on a couple of these points here, you said we need more effective outcomes, lower costs. Trump, on the campaign trail, one of his biggest issues is cutting taxes. Though when you turn on CNN or one of the leftist TV channels, a lot of the people would say that cutting taxes isn't quite right for our country. We need the money in the government to spend it. And Trump's trying to put no tax on tips, no tax on overtimes, and all these things he's trying to cut taxes on. Can America survive on lower taxes? Can the government survive with taxes being cut under Trump, or are they just lying through the skin of their teeth?
Look, well, our experience was that if you cut the right taxes and you cut the right regulations, you create such enormous increase in economic activity that you actually increase total revenue because you have more people at work, they're earning bigger salaries, they're paying more taxes, but they're doing it in a happy, positive way. So I would say I do think that there are ways that you can cut taxes and get economic growth. But in addition, I'll give you one example. Boeing was going to launch an expedition to Europa. Boeing was going to launch a satellite to study Europa, which I think is the moon of Jupiter. And they were going to charge about $1.4 billion. SpaceX came in and said they would do the same mission for $180 million. Now, that means you're saving $1.2 billion to get exactly the same thing done. You can go through the federal government and find so many areas of absurdity that I think just cutting out stupidity saves you about a third of the total deficit. I think if you then have structural reforms, for example, every able-bodied adult who gets money from the government should work. I mean, there's no reason we should be subsidizing somebody to sit at home and play computer games and teach them how to be dependent and have no future. So those are the kind of things that when you add them together, that's how we got to a balanced budget for 4 years.
And the dependency state is exactly what the Democrats want, exactly how they gain more and more control, is for people to depend on the government.
If you think of the Democratic Party as a large conspiracy of interest groups designed to take money from the taxpayers and reward each other for being Democrats, you can understand a great deal of where we are. I do want to go a step further. Not only had we balanced the budget for 4 years, but when I left office, Alan Greenspan, who then was chairman of the Federal Reserve, gave a speech in which he said they were looking at the possibility that by 2009, we would in fact have paid off the national debt. And they were trying to figure out how the Federal Reserve would manage the money supply if there was no debt, because nobody had done that since 1837. Now, unfortunately, neither George W. Bush nor his team understood what we had done and understood how to do it. And they did a whole range of things that were unnecessarily wasteful, and they didn't try to set priorities. And that's one of the keys. You know, a family has to sit down and say, we have this much money for next year. Now, we can go on a vacation. This actually happened to me at one point. We had a chance to go visit my father, who was stationed in Panama. And so my wife and my two daughters and I had a discussion. We could either go on vacation and see them and stop in Jamaica and have a great couple weeks, or we could buy a dishwasher. Well, as you might imagine, the vote was 3-1. My wife voted for the dishwasher, and my two daughters and I voted for the trip, and she said, that's fine. And we're going to go on the trip, but guess who's going to wash dishes for the next year? And so my daughters and I then had to pay for the vacation the hard way. But we were setting, we were making a choice within a limited budget. The Congress should, and the president should regard every dollar as belonging to an American and should ask themselves, do I have the right to take, why am I taking this dollar away from their family? And what is it I'm about to do with this dollar that's so important that their family doesn't get? And I think when you take that kind of approach, you really get a very different reaction, and you really do change things pretty dramatically.
And that is a great example, because if, for sure, Congress only imagined spending their own money or somebody else's, they wouldn't be there. You said the dishes. When you got back from that trip, you had a whole year of washing dishes. How many years do you think it would take of washing dishes, per se, to pay off the $34 trillion, to get out of debt? Because we're all focused on cutting the spending, but the debt's still going up.
I think it would take about 10 years to get to a balanced budget and about 20 years to pay off the debt.
And
but I think you would then be an unbelievably powerful country that had huge economic advantages over everybody else. I'll give you a number that startled me when I read it the other day. In 2008, the European Union, the collection of countries that make up the European Union, their entire economic activity was about the same as the United States. Last year, the U.S. was 75% bigger than the European Union. We had grown that much faster. And that's because we have entrepreneurs. They focus on bureaucracy. We focus on entrepreneurs. So we invent Apple, or we invent Microsoft. We invent SpaceX. They're busy trying to regulate them out of business because they can't compete. Their system doesn't tolerate the kind of entrepreneurship that we encourage. So I would like to see us, your debt shrinks dramatically if your economy gets bigger. So if we tripled the size of the American economy in the next generation and everybody was dramatically better off, the debt would become almost irrelevant. But I think at a reasonable pace, without doing extraordinary things, you could easily get to a balanced budget in less than a decade.
I know in economics, not to go off on a tangent here, but there's a thing called cutting-edge growth versus growth of like a newer country. I see the countries in Africa and China where they're growing rapidly fast, almost up to 10%. But the cutting-edge countries are growing at 3 or 4%. How does that factor into balancing the budget over 10 years where we're only growing at 3 or 4% a year, if that's correct?
Well, under Reagan, we were growing at about 5 or 5.5%. Reagan once said, if you took every economist in the country and laid them end to end, that would be a good thing. So I'm a historian. I'm not an economist. I think they're trying to think up artificial explanations of why we can't do things. I authored, along with Congressman Bob Walker, the first bill that would create a reusable rocket on the grounds that if you could reuse it, it'll become much cheaper. We got $400 million for NASA to try to build a reusable rocket. They hired Lockheed Martin. They failed and gave up. About a decade later, Elon Musk came along and said, if we could build a reusable rocket, it turns out that SpaceX, the Falcon 9, cuts the price of going into space by 90%. It's the most deflationary single thing outside of information technology. Cuts it by 90% and works. And I don't know if you saw the film in the last week of the Starship booster coming back down to land and landing so precisely that it was held in the grips of this elevator. But remember, the booster is the size of a skyscraper. And he's engineered it now, so because he wants to be able to use every booster at least 10 times. Now, I'm telling you that because you can have all of the equations for going into space that existed before Elon Musk, and you can have the equations that are about to emerge, and they're two totally different worlds.
They are, and I'm glad you mentioned Elon. I was about to bring him up. You just saw the SpaceX successfully brought it back down onto the landing pad, and now they can reuse it. But President Trump, he was just campaigning with him the other day in Butler. And we know that President Trump has been fond of the idea of adding Elon into part of a position in the cabinet to create a task force called Department of Government Efficiency, where Elon would cut down the size of government exponentially, like he's done at Twitter, where he cut it down almost 3/4 during his time at Twitter so far. What percentage of the government could be gotten rid of or could be cut down?
Well, I personally would rather have it be the Department of Effective Government, because you don't want to just be efficient. You want to actually get things done. You want to get Peter Drucker wrote a brilliant book called The Effective Executive, in which he argued that you really want to know what you're trying to accomplish. So it's not just activity. And I think that you can take that mindset and you can apply it to a lot of things. My personal guess is, I'll give you an example. The Pentagon was built in 1943 so that 26,000 people using manual typewriters with carbon paper and filing cabinets could manage a global war, which was the technology of 1943. Today, in that same Pentagon, you have 26,000 people with smartphones, iPads, laptops, etc. So I've never been able to get anyone to tell me the information exchange number. But if I were to give you a laptop and I was giving your person next to you a manual typewriter with carbon paper, my guess is the exchange rate is something in the order of 1,000,000 to 1, because you can type into your laptop at about the same speed that they're typing into their manual typewriter, but you can then send it worldwide. It instantly replicates. You can then store it, so it's easy to recover. So you have to say to yourself, well, if we took 26,000 people with carbon paper and a manual typewriter, how many people should it take with modern technology? And I tell every audience, if we reduced the Pentagon to a triangle and got rid of 2/3 of the Pentagon, turned it into a museum of national security, you would have a better defense system that would be leaner, faster, more rapidly innovating, and less wasteful. And that should give you some sense of how big the change could be if you had a real willingness to dig in and start changing things.
The willingness to be effective. It's one of the things that our founding fathers had and that we're lacking today. I don't want to spend all of our time just on the balanced budget. I know my young listeners might just be bored and they have a short attention span. I don't want to get them off topic here, but I want to get at something that they're probably wondering themselves, because I know I'm wondering this myself. We're young. This is the first time we're really witnessing politics at play, the first presidential election we can vote in, but this is really a presidential election we've never seen before. The leading candidate's been assassinated 2 or 3 times already. They've tried to put him in jail, all these things. And we've seen the candidate drop out on the other side, and now we got a new candidate who hasn't even been through a primary. These are unprecedented times, but you've been around the system, been around the game quite a while. Are these really unprecedented times? And if so, how?
I would say we have not seen this level of intense hostility since the election of 1860, when most southern states would not allow Lincoln to even be on the ballot. And it's for a very similar reason. We were very deeply divided in 1860 between people for whom slavery was a way of life and people who are dedicated to a future without slaves. Well, there's no compatibility. You either are going to have a country with slaves or you're not going to have a country with slaves. And from the standpoint of the South, what the North was talking about was literally the end of their way of life. So the bitterness ultimately led to a geographic civil war, which was the most costly single war we've ever fought. You have very different than when I was first in politics, or even very different when I was Speaker. Bill Clinton and I could agree on about 70 to 80%. We had a similar sense of America. We had a similar sense of our role in the world. We had a similar broad sense of the importance of free enterprise and the importance of the work ethic. Now you have really deep division between people who believe America's evil, that Christopher Columbus should be reviled because he brought Europeans to this continent, that the Constitution is an obsolete document, that biology does not exist, that the entire sense of American patriotism is a cover for white supremacy. We go down the list. And then you have another group of people who say just the opposite. We love America. We love the Constitution. We think it's fabulous that we've created this extraordinary country. Those two groups disagree so bitterly and so deeply that we're engaged in a politics of annihilation. I mean, from the standpoint of the left, Trump is terrifying because he is the end of their world. I mean, just a minor example that for many of your younger listeners will enable them to start really interesting conversations. Trump is actually going to insist that women be the only people who participate in women's sports. Well, as you know, the transgender movement will fight that very bitterly. And that means that the left will fight it very bitterly because there's this broad philosophy on the left that we are guided by whatever the most vulnerable group is this week. And so you have that whole thing. There, the other night, in her desperate effort to appeal to black voters, Kamala Harris tiptoed towards reparations. Well, for slavery. Well, it's a really extraordinarily hard problem because, first of all, you have to decide how black do you have to be to get reparations. If you are half black and half South Asian, would you qualify? If you're half white and half Kenyan, would you qualify? Those are the two most famous black Democratic politicians. If you are a movie star or singer or athlete who's worth 100 million plus, would you qualify? I mean, you start down this list and you realize the idea of reparations is almost crazy. I mean, it's one thing to say we want to help people who need help, and I'm totally for that. With Jack Kemp, help develop opportunity zones for inner cities, a variety of other things. I'm very much for supporting the historically black colleges and universities. But the idea that you would take money from people who had nothing to do with slavery. Let's say one of the highest income groups in America are Indian Americans from India. They had nothing to do with slavery. They came long after slavery. So they're supposed to now have their taxes raised to transfer it to their neighbor. Well, on the left, this is almost an act of religion. Of course you have to be for this. In the rest of the country, it's an act of idiocy. Of course you can't be for this. That's the reason that the politics we're living through right now are so extraordinarily intense. They're the politics of identity. This is who I am. So if you're against my ideas, you're against me. And my very identity is at stake. And that's why I think it's a very dangerous time. That's why you end up with, there have actually been 3 assassination attempts. The first one, the FBI stopped the Iranians, so it never showed up. Then the other 2 were random people. But if I were Donald Trump, I'd be perennially worried because he is such a gigantic threat to their world. And he is a target of continual hostility on the left.
And Mr. Speaker, I think that's a beautiful analysis. And going back to 1860, that election, it then resulted in the Civil War, as we know. And you mentioned that we have an identity crisis here. But at the crux of it, every issue that you've laid out points that it's not just, if we had another Civil War, it wouldn't just be about abortion. It's ultimately it's a worldview difference. It's a worldview crisis that we have. We have 2 different competing worldviews that can't coexist. How do they keep the fractured union together after the Civil War? How can we possibly restore this fractured union today?
Well, sadly, the lessons of history are one side has to win. You never solve these kind of problems by sitting in a nice, pleasant room and compromising, because they're too deep. I mean, when young people chant from the river to the sea, it's not clear to me how many of them understand that that's genocide. I mean, that's Hamas's slogan for eliminating all the Jews. And I think if you went up to them and said, do you really want to eliminate all the Jews? Most of them would say, no, not really, but, Palestinians deserve something. If you then pushed them and said, wait a second, what you're chanting means eliminate all the Jews, a significant percentage of them would say, okay, if the price of helping the Palestinians is wiping out 7 or 8 million Jews, it's hard, but what the heck? And that's really where we are. I mean, that's not a conversation that leads to, let's go have a beer and chat because we can really work this out. And that's why if you watch, we're talking on the day when Yahya Sinwar was apparently killed by the Israelis. He had been the mastermind, the military leader of Hamas, and the person who, more than anybody else, had designed the October 8th assault last year. He'd been in prison 21 years. And when he got out, he promptly went back to trying to destroy Israel. I think this is just, when you have opponents who are that deeply opposed, one side wins and one side loses.
And we have roughly 2 weeks before one side wins and one side loses. A lot of people would say, if the Democrats win, if Kamala wins, there's not much left for our country. And they can rapidly put our country in decline over the next 8 years. Is this really the last election if Kamala wins?
I think the great danger is weakness in foreign policy. You have a war in Ukraine, you have a war in the Middle East, you have the Chinese Communist Navy on maneuvers around Taiwan, you have an open border with the Mexican cartels, the Venezuelan gangs, the El Salvadorian gangs, a flood of fentanyl. I mean, we lose twice as many Americans to drug overdose annually as we lost in the 8 years of the Vietnam War. If we had a drug overdose wall in Washington, it would be 10 or 12 times longer than the Vietnam War. If we continue down this road, we're talking about literally national survival, not national security. And we're in trouble. We were in trouble in our schools. When you have 4 schools in Baltimore City in which out of 2,100 students, not a single one can do math. 0 out of 2,100. How are you going to compete with China? How are you going to have a free society? How do you have citizens who can't read, they can't write, they can't do math? And so I think we need to understand it's not about Kamala Harris as a person. It is that there is a fairly large left-wing establishment that believes in an alternative worldview and is prepared to use government to impose it on the rest of us. And that's why this is, in my judgment, one of the most decisive elections in American history. The difference in the world that Donald Trump would be president of and the world that Kamala Harris would be president of, it could well be the difference between a survivable, prosperous America and an America in desperate trouble from all of its various enemies ganging up on it.
In desperate trouble. The soul of America is in trouble. If you could tell, it's the last question here, then we have to wrap up on time. If you could tell America, or my generation, young people, one thing not to give up, preserve the future of our country, what's your message to young people?
My real message is, late in the evening, walk outside, look up at the sky, imagine the immensity of the universe, and that God wants you to have a full life and a great opportunity to pursue happiness, and decide that you're going to live a life worthy of an amazing country which has made you the freest, most prosperous people in the history of the human race, and then relax and enjoy it. I
have hope for the future of the country. We can turn to Christ and get young people believe in the gospel. It sure sounds like you do as well. So Speaker Gingrich, it's been a great honor having you. Look forward to having you on again one day.
Thank you, and I'm very proud of the work you're doing. It's very, very important.
Thank you.
Thank you.